Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us for our draft guidelines workshop for the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. We're going to give it another 30 seconds or so here to let people keep trickling in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Wanted to give everybody a heads up that this meeting will be recorded and posted on our website at the conclusion of this workshop. So you'll be able to access this or you can forward it to any colleagues who were unable to join. So we'll give it another few seconds here and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks. All right, I think it looks like we've reached a critical mass of folks here, so I'll go ahead and get started. Going to start with a quick round of introductions on our end. So to let you all know who's on the workshop here today. So my name is Anthony Cerna. I'm a senior advisor for Rail and Transit at the California State Transportation Agency. I'm the policy lead on the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program for CalSTA. And I'll hand it over to Cayman. Cayman, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Cayman Morgan here at Caltrans headquarters in the Division of Transportation Planning, and my team helps assist CalSTA with the pre-award process of the TIRCP program. And I'll pass it over to Henry.
Hi everyone, my name is Henry McKay, and I'm the Acting Data Science Branch Chief and the Division of Data and Digital Services at Caltrans.
And Joseph?
Joseph Karsich here at DDS over at Caltrans and helping to facilitate the workshop here today.
Great, thanks everyone. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started here. Again, as a reminder for folks that were just joining, this will be recorded and posted on our website. So if you have any colleagues that are not able to join today in person or live, you can share in the recording and they can be kept up to date that way. Cayman, can we go to the next slide, please? So here's just the brief agenda for what we're going to be covering today, including kind of what's new to the draft Cycle 8 guidelines. We're going to go over the program background. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the program already, but for folks who are thinking about applying for the first time, we'll give some background to the program. We'll also talk about some of the funding and key considerations. Then we'll kind of transition over to the timeline for the final guidelines and awards. And then we'll leave a robust amount of time for the Q&A, questions and feedback at the very end. So that's the agenda. Cayman, next slide, please. So jumping right in here, I think the biggest change for the program here is the extension of the Cap and Invest framework. As part of the most recent budget last summer, the legislature and the governor agreed to reauthorize what was formerly known as Cap and Trade. It's now called Cap and Invest. This is important because the TIRCP program receives a continuous appropriation from Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So the Cap and Invest was extended out until 2045, and there were some changes to the allocation formula for the program. So in the previous framework, the TIRCP program received a 10% continuous appropriation of all auction proceeds, all quarterly auction proceeds. That will now be capped at a maximum of $400 million per year, assuming the assumption of Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund auctions reach $4.2 billion per year. So that's kind of the big change in terms of our funding. So there's, again, funding certainty for the next 20 years. So that's really exciting for the program and will be good for the continuity of it. The other change here I'll note is inclusion of the Caltrans System Investment Strategy Framework as a secondary criteria. This is known as CSIS, which evaluates a project's alignment to the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, or CAPTI, which is a kind of foundational planning document developed by CalSTA. Next slide, please. Some other changes to note here. There was an update to the CARB guidelines and resource portal. So there's new information for the 2024, new reference to the 2024 CARB funding guidelines. And there's a new resource portal where all of the quantification methodology and everything else tied to the program are kind of kept under one roof. We'll go into a bit more detail about that a bit later. Also reduce some redundancy and improve clarity throughout the guidelines. As we were reviewing, kind of noticed areas where things were kind of mentioned 2 or 3 times, and so we're just kind of saying the same message one time and at one part of the guidelines and trying to kind of help with this, some of it being, oftentimes convoluted. So really trying to improve that clarity. And then here I wanted to reference that for cycle 8, we're expecting at least 900 million available for award. This number is subject to change as we kind of tinker with the final calculations, but I think for the purposes of this workshop here, we're expecting about 900 million, and we'll update that final number in advance of the call for projects. And then for this next section here, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Henry. Henry, you want to take it away?
Yep. Thanks, Anthony. So I'll be discussing CSIS, or the Caltrans System Investment Strategy, and how we're using it in TIRCP this time. So the Caltrans System Investment Strategy, also known as CSIS, is Caltrans's project prioritization framework used for discretionary funding prioritization. CSIS is consistent with the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, or CAPTI, and broadly assesses a project's alignment to CAPTI. The CSIS consists of 3 components. First, program fit assesses how competitive a project would be in a given funding program. In the TIRCP context, this is fairly simple. Eligible projects nominated by eligible applicants will meet the program fit criteria. These eligibility requirements are discussed in the TIRCP guidelines and haven't been modified for CSIS. So they're just the eligibility requirements that are already existing. Secondly, the CAPTI alignment metrics provide a quantitative assessment of a given project's alignment with CAPTI. This is the primary way in which CSIS will impact TIRCP, and we'll discuss this in more detail in a second. Lastly, CSIS includes other considerations such as delivery risk and to what degree a project leverages matching funds. We're not introducing any new CSIS-specific other considerations for TIRCP, and these are already captured in the program guidelines. It is worth noting that, by definition, projects eligible and that are going to be applying to the TIRCP program are already generally CAPTI aligned. They're rail and transit projects that are expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That being said, the CSIS process, particularly the CAPTI alignment metrics, assess the benefits provided by a given project and are still really useful for quantifying the distribution of said benefits, both in terms of who receives the benefits and which projects are able to provide the most benefits to the most people. Next, I'll discuss the CSIS CAPTI alignment metrics in more detail. So there are 11 CAPTI alignment metrics, 9 of which are quantitative and 2 are qualitative. Applicants aren't expected to actually calculate these metrics and submit them to us. Instead, Caltrans staff will score the metrics based on input data provided by applicants, which will be discussed in more detail in a bit. Next, I'll walk through each of the metrics very briefly. So first, we look at safety. And in the transit context, in transit and rail context, there are a few types of projects that generally receive positive safety scores, such as grade crossings. But we also look at sort of the larger VMT ridership impacts. So if your project is taking a lot of cars off the road, we recognize that that's going to have a positive safety impact, which is captured in CSIS. We also look at vehicle miles traveled as its own metric. And so, many rail and transit projects are expected to reduce VMT, or vehicle miles traveled. Next, and this is probably one of the most important metrics to CSIS and to TIRCP in particular, we look at access to destinations. And so we measure, to what degree a given project will increase people's ability to reach jobs and non-work destinations. We also look at disadvantaged communities' access to destinations and assess how access to critical jobs and services will change specifically for low-income communities across the state. We also look at disadvantaged communities in terms of traffic impacts. So projects that reduce traffic burdens that specifically burden low-income communities can receive credit here. And then we also look at passenger mode shift in a quantitative way. So we look at the degree to which a project would shift people away from auto modes. And so in this case with TIRCP, it's going to be most projects to some extent, but this metric is able to kind of distinguish the ones that are going to have the greatest mode shift impact. Next, for land use and natural and working lands, we're primarily, in the context of rail and transit projects, looking at how projects create new high-quality transit areas per statute. But we also look at a number of factors and project components that are land use supportive of sustainable land use. And then we also look at freight sustainability and efficiency. This is one that many projects won't necessarily move the needle on much, but there can be some projects that have a positive impact on freight movement and freight sustainability, and so we can definitely score or add points to those projects based on the criteria. And then lastly, on the quantitative metrics side, we look at zero emission vehicle or ZEV infrastructure, and this is one that's going to be applicable to a lot of TIRCP projects. We also have two qualitative metrics in CSIS, public engagement as well as climate adaptation and resiliency. So these are both based on a rubric and extensive review of documentation that's submitted. And so these will be reviewed by as sort of part of the project review committees. So we'll be happy to take any questions regarding these metrics at the end, as they are fairly technical and we just went over them quickly. But there is also extensive metric documentation linked in the program guidelines, as well as available on the Caltrans website. And we're available if you have any questions about how these metrics apply. We'll also be releasing a memo with the call for projects, discussing each metric in a little bit more detail, and specifically pointing out how the metric should be thought of in the context of rail and transit projects. Some metrics such as access to destinations and safety are already included in TIRCP in the guidelines, but just weren't explicitly quantified before. And now with CSIS, we have a quantification methodology. Next slide. So next I'll go over some of the data requirements that we have for CSIS. Scoring projects for CSIS requires several pieces of input data, some of which we already require in the TIRCP guidelines, but we will be requesting this data in a more structured format in an intake form, and we'll be releasing more information on how to do that with the call for projects. Projects in this program likely won't have an impact on all metrics, so there will be a lot of cases where certain data inputs aren't available and probably aren't even necessary as the project might not impact that particular metric. A good example would be a local bus project probably won't move the needle on freight. And as such, there is a lot of freight data inputs that we request that just won't be available or applicable. And so we'll be really clear about what those are. And in that memo we're going to be providing, we will kind of make it clear how CSIS considers transit and rail benefits for all the metrics. And this can be a useful resource to determine, is your project likely to have an impact on any of these metrics? And if so, is it worth actually gathering the data in support of them? Or is it a metric where the project's not going to move the needle and you don't need to worry about the data? And that is all for CSIS. So next I'll pass it back to Anthony. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. So now we're going to jump over to some of the updates to some of the Air Resources Board, the CARB updates. So here, there was the 2024 funding guidelines overhauled several key areas of the CARB funding guidelines, including a new section on job quality standards and strategies to bolster workforce development. This is being responsive to AB 680, which ensures that public funds support fair labor practices, high quality jobs, and a livable wage. So that's one of the big changes to the CARB funding guidelines. In other jobs-related updates, the jobs and modeling co-benefit assessment methodology, which used to be a requirement with the applications, that's no longer a required element of the application package. That's now calculated or modeled at the program level once all data has been approved, kind of during the reporting process. So that doesn't fall to the individual agencies anymore. So that's a change there. In terms of folks that receive awards, the CARB annual reporting has been pushed up 1 month earlier in the year. So in the past, it used to be the reporting process would happen during the month of December, which hit a lot of the kind of holidays at the end of the year and I think led to some kind of impacts to the schedule there. So now reporting is going to be November 1st through the end of November for CARB reporting. And again, that's only for folks that have received awards in the past. There are also recommendations for direct outreach and community engagement, and that's been strengthened across various sections of the funding guidelines. And lastly here, just wanted to reference that the program will still be using the Cal Enviro Screen 4.0. There is a draft Cal Enviro Screen 5.0 out, but for this current cycle of TIRCP, we're going to keep on with the kind of most updated and the most recently approved version, which is the 4.0. So next slide, please. This is a discussion of the new CARB resource portal. So the items here is that CARB has created a new portal intended to support applicants, grantees, administrators, et cetera, in more easily accessing and implementing the CCI, the California Climate Investments programs and projects. So this is going to be basically a clearinghouse where all of the quantification methodology documents and calculator tools can be found on one webpage here. Applicants can either directly access it through this link or by scrolling through the resource portal and selecting the California Climate Investments reporting. So it's really just a clearinghouse to kind of have all of the tools and all of the materials in one area. On the tools webpage, there's also a built-in window containing all of the available tools, which can be filtered by agency, program, or tool type, really trying to make it more easier for folks to access. Next slide, please. And then really quickly here, updates on the actual quantification methodology, which is foundational to our program. This is how we model expected greenhouse gas reductions from the program. So there's no major changes to the methodology, but there are some back-end updates to carbon intensity and passenger GHG emissions factors. The final version will be posted in early 2026. The one thing to note here is that in the past the program has used what we call benefit criteria tables, which basically surveyed the expected benefits to disadvantaged communities and priority populations. So now that's going to be part of the benefit assessment table. The purpose here is basically very similar to what we used in previous versions, but it's updated to better reflect current project types and priority populations and current policy. So we'll be using that. And then, as I mentioned before, jobs modeling is no longer required for the Cycle 8 application. The modeling will be done at a program level, but it's no longer the responsibility of the applicant or administering agency. Next slide. So that was the portion of the workshop here where we kind of went over some of the primary updates, the guidelines. Here we'll give just a very brief background on the program. As I mentioned before, many of you listening have probably applied and been awarded funding through the program, so you're already very familiar with this. But for the folks who are thinking about submitting applications for the first time, this might be helpful for you. So the TIRCP receives funding primarily through the transportation improvement fee implemented by SB1, as well as a continuous appropriation from quarterly cap and invest auction proceeds, which, as I discussed earlier, is up to $400 million annually. That's a ceiling for the program, not a floor. Since 2015, over $11.5 billion in TIRCP funded has been awarded to 153 projects throughout the state. So this is really a flagship program for CalSTA and a very important way to fund critical rail and transit projects throughout the state. There is a program focused on priority populations, which we just discussed, meaning projects are expected to contribute direct, meaningful, and assured benefits to disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and low-income households. We have a programmatic goal of a certain amount of funding being directly invested in these communities, so that's a critical piece. We also have a focus on ensuring geographic equity. So obviously we want to ensure that we have a balanced investment portfolio for the state of California when we invest in our public infrastructure. So really considering geographic equity so that we avoid investing in specific regions of the state, and we really make sure to have that level of balance. So that's also a priority. Next slide, please. This is just a really high-level example of some past awards. Really funding everything from transit and rail infrastructure to zero-emission vehicle procurements that really improve ridership and expand service and improve ridership. Fleet to support service expansion. The key being zero-emission, the purchase of zero-emission vehicles. That's been a focus for the program. We have a a full list of all of the awards since 2015 can be found on our website as noted there. Next slide, please. So quickly here, when this program was created in 2015, it was created as a competitive 5-year program to fund a small number of transformative projects that improve the statewide rail and transit network while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There are 4 statutory evaluation criteria, which are the primary lens of how we view eligibility for projects, which is 1, reduction of emissions, 2, does it move the needle on ridership growth, 3, how well it integrates and improves the integration of the state's rail and transit network, and 4, how much it improves safety, so improving safety for transit riders. Those are the 4. There are also a number of secondary evaluation criteria in addition to the new CSIS secondary criteria, including co-benefits of broader sustainable community goals, as I mentioned, benefits to disadvantaged and priority populations, looking at and considering geographic balance, looking at general network integration, as well as some housing and jobs and land use considerations. So really trying to move the needle on, tying investments in transit and rail with our land use decisions to have better outcomes overall. Next slide, please. So some considerations for applicants here. I've kind of sound like a broken record here, but there is a focus on priority populations. As I mentioned before, we do have a programmatic goal of a certain amount of investment for priority populations. We also want to focus on ensuring geographic equity. So it's considered within each funding cycle. Underrepresentation in past funding cycles may also be considered in terms of creating a balanced investment portfolio for California. And requirements for geographic equity statewide may limit the amount of funding within a region, but again, we consider that on a kind of cycle by cycle basis. Next slide, please. And I mentioned previously an emphasis on clean technology. So we allow eligible clean fleet, facility, and network improvement projects when tied with qualifying efforts. So for example, replacing aging vehicle fleets with zero emission vehicles, if we can really tie that to increasing ridership, either by expanding service or other ways, can fund fueling and charging infrastructure that support these efforts. Additional kind of efforts that are qualifying include network efficiency, with, for example, transit priority investments. So if we're making the service more efficient and an agency is realizing cost savings that we can then redeploy into more service hours, more vehicle hours, et cetera, that's an eligible use of funding to really enhance those that network efficiency. Also, examples such as implementing contactless payment, which is shown to have kind of direct across the board ridership improvements just by making it easier to ride and pay for transit and really removing that barrier. And then other examples like improving integration with other corridors. So really lining up schedules, the program can help fund, efforts that, for example, line up schedules or making sure that, there's that network integration that makes it really seamless for a passenger to go from one operator to another, and really removing those barriers to entries, I should say. Next slide, please. And I also mentioned right before this the interest in tying land use decisions with transit and rail investments. So we do have a housing and jobs consideration as part of the secondary criteria, which is still a policy priority. So recognizing that transit supportive land use decisions are a key influencing factor of ridership. Projects can basically claim ridership benefits expected from entitled housing projects within half a mile of transit stations that are expected to be delivered within the required project outcome reporting period. We can also, give credit for projects that link housing with key destinations. So we've had a number of really exciting kind of projects funded in recent years that really co-locate and link a lot of these housing developments with really strong rail and transit infrastructure. So that's an area that we're still very interested in, as well as obviously documenting community benefits for projects. Next slide, please. So that's the gist of the kind of workshop here. Overall, in terms of timeline here, we're we're really aiming to have the final call for projects and the final guidelines adopted by February 20th. So next, what is that? Next Thursday, next Friday. Sorry. If you can get us any public comments by this February 17th, so we have enough time to review everything, incorporate everything into the guidelines, and be able to really take your feedback. We're expecting applications due May 14th. And before that, here in early March, we're going to have that kind of 2-week blitz of the one-on-one consultations where we give the opportunity basically for potential applicants to come in and meet with us, ask us targeted questions, allow us to give you all targeted feedback. We found this to be really helpful in previous years. So that our staff has a better understanding of kind of what kind of projects to expect, who's going to come in, and kind of what level of ask there will be. Also really helpful, we've heard from the agency perspective, right, where you get a chance to ask these very specific questions and ask for advice and feedback on kind of how to make an application more competitive. So really encourage you all to reach out to our TIRCP comments inbox for those 2 weeks in March. There may be some wiggle room to kind of push out beyond the 13th, depending on how much interest we get. But for now, we're really targeting those 2 weeks, that 2-week period there. And finally here, we're expecting award announcements by September 18th, 2026, so a bit later in the summer. This is subject to change, but that's the kind of the North Star that we're working towards and working backwards from. Next slide, please. So with this, wanted to open up for some Q&A. Again, wanted to reiterate quickly here. If you have any comments or want to sign up for one of those one-on-one consultation meetings, please reach out to the TIRCP comments at dot.ca.gov. That's our main kind of monitored inbox that the team monitors. So please reach out to that. And with that, I'll pause here and we'll start the Q&A portion of this. If you want to use you can use the Q&A function in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will, one of us will unmute you so you can ask your question in person. So I'll pause there and let folks start asking some questions for us. And I see one in the Q&A, one early one from Christina. I'm looking at access for older adults with disabilities and low access to transit areas. Where might this score for eligibility? Sorry, adults 18 to 64 and older adults. Yeah, so I think, Christina, that sounds like it'd be an eligible project if it's a publicly run service. I think we need to know a bit more in terms of the specifics of the project, but I think from what you're asking here, if it's a publicly run and operated service, this sounds like it would be eligible to compete for the program. I see a hand raised. Assad, LA Metro. Joseph or Cayman, can you unmute Assad, please? Hey there, looks like you're off mute. Nope, now you're back on mute.
Try it again.
All right, it looks like you're off mute again. Hello?
Can you hear me, Anthony?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. How are you?
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Assad Hamid, LA Metro. The first one is just a request due to the inconsistency between the announcement and the guidelines. The due date for comments, the guidelines is February 18th and the announcement is the 17th. If possible, okay. Just to make it on the 18th because 16th is a holiday.
Yeah.
That's appreciate that.
We can do that. Good flag. I didn't realize there was a discrepancy there.
Thank you, Anthony. And regarding the funding, so
yes.
This was a major question for us about the funding estimate, and actually a little bit surprised about the 900 million. It seems to be too conservative, although Cap and Invest is a maximum of 400 million per year. The 900 million translates into 180 million per year. So the question is, why being this conservative? And is this the assumption? I'm guessing the 900 million is at least, but is for new projects. And then the balance contingent on the revenues from the auction proceeds, and SB1 will be for fulfill funding commitments through the prior cycles 7. Is that the intent, that you will have 900 at least for new projects, and then whatever the balance is to fulfill commitments for projects already selected in prior cycles?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think we were being conservative just until we have a better understanding of the quarterly auction proceeds. We've seen an impact. They've been coming in a bit lower, I think, than we had been used to in previous years. So when we say at least, right, like we are open to retweaking that into the future. In the future, once we have a better understanding, and again, I think we will be revisiting this number before the final call for projects out. But yeah, wanted to be conservative so that we're not over promising in terms of the actual amount of resources. And to your second question, all resources will be committed for new projects. So I think what you might be referencing in terms of resources for previously awarded projects, that was a one-time kind of category in the 2023 cycle where the legislature and the governor put an infusion of general fund into the program to help support projects that are facing kind of significant cost increases. So that was a one-time thing. And so moving forward with these regular kind of cycled projects, the regular every 2-year projects or programs, it's going to be for prospective projects into the future, and it's going to support only new projects. So yeah, I think we'll definitely revisit the fund estimate, but wanted to be conservative here so that we're not over-promising the amount of resources available.
No, thanks, Anthony, for clarifying. That's my final comment. So pretty much confirming that the funding coming from Cap and Invest starting in fiscal year 27 through 31, the 5-year program of this new cycle will be for new projects. And again, just I want to emphasize that for agencies, Metro and other, to increase their chances to leverage TIRCP funds when seeking federal grants, I think it's better to be more aggressive. You may have a contingency list, but certainly, being selected for a grant award increases the chances to secure funding. And with that said, we suggest having a tier for submitting applications and projects being announced for awards, similar to what was done for AB 180 Cycle 6, especially to try to meet federal deadlines, and leverage the scarce federal funding under the new circumstances, is that maybe you will have, for those applications seeking grant awards from major federal programs, to have a more recent or immediate announcement. And for other projects, for example, for this category, it will be like maybe June 18th. And for other projects could be, as you propose in the guidelines, September 18th. But those, 3 months, I think, will give a lot of chances to project sponsors to seek and apply for federal funds. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Really, really helpful feedback. I have a question here from Vanessa. Does the application require a benefit cost analysis? No, we do not require a specific one. I think agencies for applications do, provide some of this information, but we don't have a specific one that we use for the program. If anybody has any more questions, I'm not seeing any hands up or anything in the chat, so I'll give it a few more moments here. See if any other questions trickle in. All right, seeing none, seems like we can wrap up a bit early today. So really want to thank you all for taking the time to join this workshop here. Again, we'll be posting this online. If you have any questions after this or kind of formal comments, please send those into the TIRCP comments at dot.ca.gov, and so we can take everything into consideration. And with that, I think we will wrap it up. And again, thank you all for joining.